Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a little 7-game slate here for college basketball. It's a pretty interesting little slate. Most of the games are all pretty tight games. Let me go through the games real quick first. So I have Butler over Providence. I have Iowa over Nebraska. I have DePaul over Georgetown. I have FAU over North Texas. I have Cincinnati over Tulane, and I have Utah over California, and then I have Stanford over Colorado. All these games are relatively close, and when it comes to their spreads, usually I think the worst one is a or is actually a 10-point spread, which is Utah and California. Everything else is within 5 or 6 points or closer. Several of these games are basically 2-point games as well. So, really tight games here. There is pretty good value on this particular slate as well, which is nice. But I think this is a decent uh, DFS slate simply because there is some good value and there's some really good higher price guys available here. So with that said, let's get into it. So we're going to start off with our guards, and we're going to start off with Jalen Cook for Tulane. He's in a really good spot here. He's only played the last 5 games as a starter, outside of one game earlier in the season. But then he's been the starter since then, and he hasn't had a single game under 29 fantasy points. And his price is not as bad as some, it's actually pretty good for that situation here. He's been starting and he's had some really big games. He's one of my favorite plays on the slate overall. He's actually a guy that I would consider to be a lock today. For a guard that's also averaging over 1 fantasy point per minute, this is really good. And I think he's the best play on the slate in general. Then we're going to look at, see here, Jalen Forbes for Tulane as well. Now, he hasn't been quite as consistent as Cook, but he has no games under 19 fantasy points on the season, and he does play 30 minutes a game. His price is a little bit higher, and he's at 0.92 fantasy points per minute. So if you could probably find a way to actually work both those guys in your lineup if you wanted to. And Tulane is one of the higher scoring teams on the slate at 73 points projected, but they aren't projected to win against Cincinnati. But they do play hard and play well, and I expect Forbes and Cook both to play well. But I do think Cook is a better option. But you wouldn't be criminal to consider both. Then we're going to look at Primo Spears here. Now, he's a little bit more expensive. He's had one game under 21 fantasy points all season long, and he's getting 35 minutes a game. His upside is also there. He has some 40-point games as well, so he also looks pretty good. He's not my favorite play on the slate. He's only averaging 0.77 fantasy points per minute, but he gets a ton of minutes, and that makes him viable on the slate. Then we're going to look at Landers Nolly the second for Cincinnati. Now, he's in an interesting spot here. He's been solid upside, but isn't as high as some of the other guys, but his price is still pretty good, and he's been getting consistent minutes, and he's been having mostly good games most of the year. He's had a couple off games, but for the most part, he's been solid, and so I think he's viable on the slate. Then for a value play, we're going to look at Nicholas Boyd for FAU. Now, obviously, FAU is one of the lower scoring teams on the slate, but he plays over 20 minutes a game, and he's only had one game under 11 fantasy points this season. And, at this price point, he doesn't need to have a big, crazy game, and he's had some 30 fantasy point games as well. So at this price point, it's just too cheap for his potential here. He's also averaging 1 fantasy point per minute, which is really good for a guy that's starting and playing over 20 minutes a game, especially at his price point. So he's definitely extremely viable on the slate. One of my favorite plays when it comes to value on this one. So then we're going to get in the forwards here, and we're going to start with Philippe Rebraca for Iowa. Now, he's an interesting spot here. He's been dominating all season. He has big-time upside. He's had 44 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games or more, and then he has only one game under 21 all season long. And Iowa is going to be one of the higher scoring teams on the slate, and they're also projected to win. I think he's in a great spot, and he has nice upside in this matchup. I really like him as a good option on the slate. Then we're going to look at Victor Larkin for Cincinnati. Now, he's been getting around 20 fantasy points a game on average. His price isn't super ideal, but he has been getting minutes in the mid-20s, which is what limits him. He averages a ridiculous 1.28 fantasy points per minute, which is really, really good, and his price is decent enough that he's viable on the slate. He's not a must-play, but he's a viable play for a team that has a good chance to win their game and be one of the highest-scoring teams on the slate overall. Then we're going to look at Derek Walker here for Nebraska. Now, he's in an interesting spot here. He's missed the first 5 games of the year, but he's started every game since, and he's only had 2 games under 26 fantasy points. Most of the games are over 30 fantasy points, so he's been really solid. His price point has come up slightly because he's been having such good games, but I think he's in a great spot here, and his team is going to need him to play well in order to win. He's also averaging 1.06 fantasy points a game. And then we're going to look at Patrick McCaffrey for Iowa at $6,900. He has been a pretty good option here to save some money if you want. He has mid-30 upside, and he's had a few games sub-20 fantasy points, but overall he's been pretty solid most of the season. He's had one really bad game against TCU, but overall Iowa is projected to play and score a lot of points and win, and I expect him to play well in that game. He has averaged 1.92 fantasy points per game, so not quite as good as some of the other guys, but still solid enough to be viable on the slate, and a good pivot off of Larkin if you want. Then we're going to look at Rosado for FAU. He's another guy I really like for Florida Atlantic. He is basically minimum price at $4,000, and he has no games under 10 fantasy points. Now, he does come off the bench, and so his minutes are a little bit capped as a result. But when he does play, he plays a lot, plays hard, and he seems to do well. Even if he doesn't score a ton, it doesn't matter. You don't need a ton of points from a guy when he's 4,000. He helps you pay up for some other guys, and so I think he's very viable on the slate. And so that's what I have for this particular slate. I think it's a really solid daily fantasy sports slate. Sometimes they're not as easy as others. We got some wins yesterday, which is really nice, and so we'll hopefully continue that. I think the amount of value that's on the slate, having 2 or 3 guys that are under 5,000, is definitely makes the slate viable. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.